separated by 3,000 miles. When we think of Hollywood, we don't necessarily associate it with Washington politics. But art, by its very nature, imitates and reflects life. Whether promoting lifestyles, ideology, or war, the media has a powerful hold over public opinion.
Hollywood creates the grand perception of the world. It is the wizard behind the veil.
We know politicians court Hollywood stars for support. Katy Perry was paid over $70,000 to perform for the Hillary Clinton campaign. While it seems no money was needed for Clint Eastwood to stump at the Republican National Convention in 2012. Harvey Weinstein's ties to the Clintons and Barack Obama run deeper than the millions of dollars of campaign contributions he's raised. Obama's daughter Malia went to intern for the Weinstein Company after his presidency. But political campaign support should be expected from citizens, celebrity or not. The deeper threat arises when film and media are influenced to tell stories on behalf of the political establishment. Such products could be construed as propaganda.
There are an awful lot of people in Hollywood who have some kind of relationship with the CIA and Department of Defense. An awful long list of individuals that we put in the book. I mean, loads of these people have visited Langley, and some of them have closer connections than that. So Ben Affleck, for instance, Ben Affleck's former wife, Jennifer Garner, did unpaid recruitment ads for the CIA.
In early 2013, Americans might have found it curious to see the First Lady appear via satellite at the Academy Awards ceremony to announce the Best Picture Oscar for a film about the rescue of American hostages from Iran in 1980 by the CIA.
Well, when I think of other films, big films, that have conveyed the CIA's message, I think of Argo. Argo is a film that talks about the daring do of a couple of CIA agents who go to Iran and rescue 6 American diplomats. The Iranians wanted to let go of those hostages pretty quickly. They didn't really want to cause a problem with the United States of America. But Ayatollah Khomeini, who has been personified as evil in the U.S. press, had made a deal with the Reagan administration, or the Reagan campaign at that point, not to release the hostages. And only after Reagan had been elected, strangely enough, that day the hostages were released. So that film neglects to mention how pivotal the Reagan administration was, or the Reagan campaign was, in making sure that those hostages weren't released. It was called the October Surprise.
The October Surprise may have set the stage for the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s, as Reagan's White House cut deals with the Iranian government to sell them arms in exchange for assistance in releasing American hostages, including CIA agents, in Lebanon. The proceeds from those arms sales were illegally diverted to the Contra armies fighting to overthrow the socialist government in Nicaragua.
He'd betrayed America. What he had done was far worse than Nixon and Watergate. And here was Reagan getting away with it. And Katharine Graham, she was one of the leaders of the conservative movement there to kill off. She said no more Watergates, because she said the country can't survive it. So when the Iran-Contra broke, there was no cooperation from the media to go after Reagan on that.
So, for example, in 1994, there was a film called Countermeasures, which had been scripted and greenlit. It was going to star Sigourney Weaver, Gina Davis. It was, a big production. But it was set on an aircraft carrier, and it referred to Iran-Contra, the CIA gun-running scandal involving Iran and Nicaragua and El Salvador and so on. And the military literally said in a memo, "We have no reason to remind the American public of the Iran-Contra scandal or to denigrate the White House." And that is the mentality there. So they said, no, we won't provide an aircraft carrier for your filming, and the film was therefore never made, even though it was a long way down the track. Now that happens time and time and time and time again, which ultimately changes the culture, the popular culture in the United States and across the West. And by changing the popular culture, you're also playing havoc with the political culture as well.
In 2017, Tom Cruise starred in American Made, a film exposing the dark side of Iran-Contra, that the CIA knew drugs were being smuggled into America to facilitate financing their Contra armies. But the film did its best to portray one of the smugglers, Barry Seal, as an independent wild card, rather than a lifelong CIA asset.
Barry Seal was one of the most important covert operatives of the U.S. from the time of the Bay of Pigs. And yet this movie has the CIA first learning about him when they see that he's successfully smuggling cigars from Cuba. The director, Doug Liman, is the son of the House Majority Counsel to the Kerry Commission that looked into Iran-Contra. They never got to the bottom of the Contra cocaine thing, but his dad was generally looked upon as a good guy. But I do research into him. First of all, he's the guy that made Oliver North famous. It was as a result of his inept questioning that Oliver North became America's hero. And then I find out that this guy, his father, also was a personal attorney for Henry Kissinger, personal attorney for Robert Vesco, personal attorney for Michael Milken, and the list goes on.
Doug Liman's father, Arthur, was not part of the subsequent Kerry subcommittees that ultimately revealed cocaine smuggling in the Contra supply network. When journalist Gary Webb published articles in the San Jose Mercury to better elucidate the relationship between CIA and other agencies that protected Contra drug trafficking, he was run out of mainstream journalism. His story was finally told in 2014's Kill the Messenger.
Gary Webb, was a really great investigative reporter who broke a story right at the beginning of the internet era. It was actually the first big internet news expose, and it involved some allegations of CIA-connected drug sales in the 1980s and LA's biggest crack kingpin, Freeway Ricky Ross, who was well known to the public because the LA Times had already called him the kingpin of crack cocaine, the person most responsible for the rise of the drug epidemic. Gary Webb came along and revealed that Nicaraguans working with the CIA had actually provided him with cheap cocaine for all these years. The three major newspapers all stepped in with the Washington Post, which has traditionally been like the attack dog of the CIA over the decades, and to a certain extent still is. They just attacked Gary's story and then attacked Gary's entire career and tried to discredit him and drove him out of journalism. Nothing like that has ever happened before or since, to my knowledge. And again, as you mentioned, it drove him out of journalism and ultimately destroyed his life.
The relationship between the ruling elite and media has existed since the origin of newspapers. But in 1917, Congressman Calloway and Moore sounded the alarm that the J.P. Morgan Bank, working with big steel, shipping, and weapons manufacturers, had purchased controlling interests in 25 of the largest newspapers across the country to promote American entry into the First World War on the side of the British and French, who owed the Morgan banks hundreds of millions of dollars in wartime debts. Hollywood was quickly recruited to the war cause.
In 1917, the government started to issue what they called at the time Liberty Bonds, and Hollywood rallied to the cause and helped sell these Liberty Bonds. You had people like Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, and other Hollywood stars out there promoting these war bonds.
The whole field of public relations, in fact, the name public relations was created by a guy named Bernays. He created the field, he was a young man, specifically to sell war bonds for the First World War. That was the origin of what we now know as public relations. And he realized instead of telling people, buy bonds because you'll make some money off your bonds, save it will help America. Instead it was like, you're buying bonds to defeat the Hun, that killing babies in Belgium. This was his propaganda, So if you're against killing babies in Belgium, buy U.S. war bonds. And so the whole war bond propaganda, that was the very first use of what we today call public relations.
But you also had during World War I the beginnings of government propaganda on a much larger scale. Much of this was run through the Committee on Public Information that was headed by George Creel. And they were deliberately trying to manipulate the public to support the war. And they did that on a lot of different fronts. Again, during World War I, this was a time when you had vast censorship, where it was against the law to oppose the draft. It was against the law to publicly speak against the war, really. And many very patriotic Americans were thrown into prison during World War I because they were opposing the war, including Eugene Debs, including Big Bill Haywood, people who spoke out against World War I as being a war in which working class kids were being sacrificed in the name of profits for the big banks.
In the 1930s, radio was the internet of its day, and programs like the Radio Research Project at Princeton University, with Rockefeller Foundation financing, had already begun to discern that, in the words of Theodore Adorno, radio music listeners are not childlike, but they are childish. Their primitivism is not that of the undeveloped, but that of the forcibly retarded. Frank Stanton was one of the project's directors before becoming president of CBS News.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity.
In 1938, Orson Welles created a national panic with his radio broadcast of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. About a quarter of the listeners on Halloween morning actually believed they were being invaded by the dread Germans. And 3 years later, that attack did come, not by Germans or Martian invaders, but by the Japanese.
One of the ironies is that many of the people who were going to be blacklisted and graylisted during the McCarthy period were the ones who were out there promoting the war and promoting war bonds during the war.
In the hysteria of the early Cold War, anyone seen as pro-communist, despite the Soviets being America's strongest ally during the war, were now subject to loyalty oaths, background checks, and even unemployment. While some Hollywood actors like Ronald Reagan actually became FBI informants, others refused to disavow their First Amendment freedom of political association during the witch hunt.
In September of 1947, we've got the first hearings about the Hollywood 10, as we've come to know them. They actually called for 41 witnesses, 19 of whom they expected to be hostile. Of those 19, 10 testified. 10 leading Hollywood people, 7 of whom were writers. Only 1 was an actor, but they claimed the First Amendment and refused to answer questions about their political affiliations based upon the First Amendment. They were later found to be in contempt. They were sent to prison in 1950. These are people like Dalton Trumbo, Ring Lardner. Lardner was the most highly paid and successful screenwriter in Hollywood at the time. I mean, these are the top names. These were Academy Award winners, and they were clearly very, very patriotic, and they refused to talk about whether they had been members of the Communist Party. There was nothing illegal about being a member of the Communist Party, and given America's commitment to First Amendment rights, there was no reason why they should be called to testify about that. But careers were ruined.
And my uncle was blacklisted, Oliver Crawford, who later became head of the Screenwriters Guild. And, you know, we do forget that Hollywood was very complicit. And while we talk about there's the story, the unfriendly 10 writers like Dalton Trumbo, who had written anti-war scripts, and now they are being labeled as communists because they weren't going along with the new militarism. But remember, Hollywood did turn in these people. My uncle could not get work. It was very, very difficult to break through. It took him 10 years of being terrorized and being knocked out to be able to get back to Hollywood. And even then, things had to be sanitized.
Our culture is awash in lies, dominated by streams of never-ending electronic hallucinations that merge fact and fiction until they are indistinguishable. We have become the most illusioned society on earth. Politics is a species of endless and meaningless political theater. Politicians have morphed into celebrities. Our two ruling parties are in reality one party, the corporate party. And those who attempt to puncture this vast, breathless universe of fake news designed to push through the cruelty and exploitation of the neoliberal order are pushed so far to the margins of society, including by a public broadcasting system that has sold its soul for corporate money, that we might as well be mice squeaking against an avalanche. But squeak we must.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard.
There's a myth that Hollywood was this great liberal outlet. Because when the liberals had it, there was not really any discussion of class war in America, of who's controlling America. In other words, it was soft liberal social issues like gay rights, civil rights, but remember, not too early, only kind of after Martin Luther King smashed them in the face and they couldn't ignore him at the Selma March and Bloody Sunday. But so you have basically social liberalism, women's rights. But again, it's soft stuff, soft liberalism.
While Hollywood tends toward liberality on social issues, its war films rarely question the heroism or benevolent intentions of American troop deployments since World War II.
My father was in that war, and he hated these war movies because of the glorification. He said they're leaving out the real horror show. And because of that, he couldn't stand watching these glorifications of the Second World War.
I really hope you understand how impossible it was to make Platoon. I mean, it was written in 1976. It was not made till 86. I was turned down dozens of times. It was very hurtful. And to be rejected, people would say, it's a great script. It did help my reputation as a writer, but no one would make it because it was too depressing, they said. But I said, what's depressing about the truth? You've got to, truth should be in the movies, but that's a conflict that goes to the heart of Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood was never based on telling the truth. You can't lose money being American. Lone Survivor, he carried Chuck Norris metamorphed into Mark Wahlberg in Lone Survivor, and he kills, how many? I mean, there's, I forgot, 7 Americans get killed. For every American, they take down 20 or 30 Taliban, of course. It's the same thing in Black Hawk Down. Every American who gets killed in that battle, check it out, has to kill like, I think 30 or 40 dark-skinned people. It's just amazingly, that's the way it has to be. There's kind of a biblical commandment that says 1 dead American equals 30, 40 foreign.
Marcus Luttrell's Lone Survivor certainly glorified the American war machine's ability to fight off overwhelming enemy odds, drawing more upon the mythology of John Wayne's Green Berets than reality. The Green Berets was made during the Vietnam War with the full cooperation of the Pentagon and President Lyndon Johnson. Likewise, Lone Survivor was made during the Afghan War with Pentagon support. It depicted Navy SEALs fending off hundreds of Taliban and killing dozens in a valiant Alamo-like last stand. But the after-action report that day only acknowledged up to 30 Taliban being present and no reports of enemy casualties. Even the Afghani man who saved Luttrell's life denounced the book.
But really what we're talking about is the military having a massive role within Hollywood in terms of manipulating script content. We've found that What was particularly interesting to us was not that there was a large number of these products that were affected, but that previous scholarship, that everyone, all journalists, everybody assumed that there were just a few hundred of these things affected. But we found, using Freedom of Information Act requests, that there are actually a few thousand. And that's obviously been what you might call a cover-up, or at least some kind of sort of soft cover-up, you may put it, to make it look like this isn't such a great issue of censorship, but it is.
Early on in my career, when I sent the Platoon script to get some Pentagon help in the Philippines, they wrote back that we had to really rethink Vietnam. Having been there as a frontline soldier, of course, I objected to all their objections. And not only that, they put out an order, not an order as much as a desist kind of memorandum to their commanders saying that the troops should not cooperate with this movie. Same thing happened to us on Born on the 4th of July.
So I was doing a TV pilot, and we were filming in Northern California, and it was written by Gary DeVore. We played these FBI agents kind of thing. And I get a knock on the door. I've gone through hair and makeup. I've memorized my lines for that day. And I get a knock on the door, and it's the second or third AD. And the guy says, "Well, Stephen, we've got these rewrites for you." You know, I was like, well, wait a second. I've already memorized my lines. Like, why the rewrites, you know? And he said, well, we talked to the FBI, and they want to make these adjustments. And that was my first kind of, I don't know, introduction to the fact that if you're playing, if the alphabet agencies or any agencies are used, like FBI, certainly CIA, anytime you're doing a film and those letters are involved, and maybe even in cases where they don't use those letters, but they use something similar, they have final approval on what's being said and what's, you know, what you're saying.
Steve Shellen is a Canadian-born actor who found success in Hollywood films like A River Runs Through It and The Bodyguard. But he alleges that when he tried to launch his own production company in Canada called Lionsgate, his endeavor was sabotaged. To this day, he does not profess to know the who or why behind it.
I had my own bad experience where I was starting a production company and it was stolen from me. My children were threatened and kidnapped. I ended up basically losing everything, including a nice house under the Hollywood sign, a farm up here in Canada. And I was on the run, being tracked and followed, and I was pretty undone by the whole experience. Well, I went in a bar in Beverly Hills one night, and I ran into Gary DeVore, and Gary was friendly as usual. "Hey, Steve, how you doing?" You know, and I was like, "Oh, Gary, you wouldn't believe this." And I gave him like the mini version of what I'd gone through. And what was kind of great is that Gary didn't look at me like I was nuts. He didn't discount what I was saying. He just basically agreed with me and said, "Yeah, well, they can do that if they want." He also told me about a project he was working on that had to do with the war in Panama, and he was divulging stuff or writing about stuff, and that you know, his buddies in the CIA were not happy.
This is 20 years ago, and we know a lot of this now. We did not then, and what this was about was the Medellin cartel sending huge amounts of cocaine into the United States, and the government being aware of it and not taking the stand against it that they might have, and that there was a tremendous amount of money from the Medellin cartel transferring this cocaine into our country that went under the guise of a business deal, I guess, and was put into Panamanian banks while Noriega was in power there with us. And the money was laundered and was spent on insurgency groups, Nicaragua, Sandinistas, all of the things that we now actually know are pretty true. But then there was none of this known, and for reasons that I was unaware of at the time, Gary was aware of all of these things.
Gary DeVore was a successful screenwriter, known for his films like The Dogs of War and Raw Deal, as well as his bizarre disappearance.
It was 1997. He was on his way back to turn a script into the studio that he was going to direct, and it was actually the only time that the finished script, the computer, all of the research was in one place. It was in his car, and he disappeared on his way back. Members of the CIA and the NSA appeared in my home within the first 4 or 5 days, and many other unusual things started happening. I realized that perhaps it was not a typical crime. It only aims in one direction. It aims in the direction that this person was definitely working with the intelligence community. They said, "Don't you believe he's dead? It's been over a year." And I said, "No. If you want me to believe he's dead, give me a body." 9 days later, I was given a body. I was awakened at 7 in the morning. It was Chase Brandon calling me from Langley saying they found the car. They found the car with the body in it. And there was a 3-hour time difference, of course, between New York and LA. And at 10 o'clock, they called me from the sheriff's department in LA to tell me they'd found the car.
Well, they found him a year later or whatever in his truck. The skeletal remains, and then his hands were supposedly thrown in the back of the truck. So I guess that was sending a message to anybody that if you go rogue, or if you go, off the ranch, as they say, or whatever, and you're hitting up against the CIA and what their plans are, then this is what we're going to do. And I guess cutting off the hands is really indicative of, that's his tool, right? His hands.
The mystery of Gary DeVore's fate may linger as long as that of JFK. But it is intriguing that DeVore's disappearance came in 1997, the year after the CIA established its first official Hollywood liaison office. It may have been merely symbolic, but it seemed to portend the coming decade of the 2000s, when the Patriot Act and a U.S.-led global war would dominate the American conscience, as though the U.S. government did not trust its citizens to think critically for themselves. And more importantly, crises would have to unfold cathartically on the big screen, where the heroes of the American intelligence services and military would inevitably fight to defend global freedom. But behind the lies, we must ask ourselves, how much have we swallowed the pill of propaganda, evolved from psychological warfare, a phrase derived from Nazi Germany's Weltanschauungskrieg, worldview warfare?